I never thought we'd be in danger. It was never a real conscious thought. After all our adventures in haunted houses, seances, and abandoned asylums, none of us had ever encountered anything dangerous. But a few years ago, that changed. It was all because of something called Force-a-Crowd. Let me explain. In my early 20s, I fell in love with the dark corners of the internet. Video essays discussing various horror threads and unexplained phenomena in the rural Midwest. The clips show seemingly impossible things that mysterious beings do to ordinary people. Some will be revealed as jokes, others will never be. I have always had a special love for local legends and gossip. There is something very real and raw in those little private whispers that are passed on exclusively by word of mouth. I have made many friends through this hobby, the first of whom is my friend Paul. We've been friends ever since we dressed as the same version of the Penguin, the villain, to a Halloween party in our late teens. I thought our temporary haunted house exploration was over when he started dating this girl, Veronica, aka Vera. However, my fears were unfounded, as she turned out to be just as weird as he is, a great addition to our horror hobby club. This trip began because Vera told us about it from her hometown, a desolate place in rural Minnesota. There was a local legend, she said, but there had been so many sightings that nothing miraculous had gone unnoticed. Paul and I were all ears. I can't believe you haven't heard of this. Does anyone know about Force-a-Crowd? He asked. Yeah, no, we didn't. So it turns out this thing is a tall tale in his neck of the woods. Force-a-Crowd has been around for decades, and it was apparently so popular that most of the locals no longer considered it a witch. Local law enforcement still had an official warning. And by warning, we meant a chain-link fence and an angry sign. So when I turned 24, we all got into Paul's car and headed out into rural Minnesota. If he was as prominent as we were told, there was no way we could have missed him. It's not as silly as it sounds. Paul and I had taken dozens of field trips to places that people swear are creepy and haunted. But up until this point, we had seen nothing but creepy paintings, some strangely colored sunflowers, and a sudden cold snap. The idea that there was anything physical and tangible seemed ridiculous. Vera had called a local friend before we arrived. This guy was a tour guide, specializing in what they call dark tourism. It's something, but often a rather grim thing. Still, he seemed capable enough. He had a few YouTube videos that we checked out. It was easy to find him then. His YouTube channel had about 200,000 subscribers. Sleeping bag. Snacks, tents, sleeping bags, a few cameras, the usual. Vera hadn't told us much about what to expect. She wanted Neil to have a chance to give us a full tour. I don't want to spoil it, he chuckled as we drove near St. Cloud. This is the thing. This is a big thing. Give us a hint, Paul pleaded. Like, a name. What is this? You know, there's a crowd of 3. But it's like 4, Neil said. Excellent and helpful. Paulie sighed and turned left onto the highway. We met our guide, Neil, on an overcast afternoon in mid-May. In the height of summer, the air was humid and the ground was muddy. There was the first drizzle in the air, and we could hear a rumble from the east. The bad weather had come in off Lake Superior. Neil was a cheerful 30-something. Khaki shorts, a small backpack, a baseball cap, and a gray long-sleeved shirt. No hair, trimmed beard, and sunny demeanor, not what I imagined a dark tourism guide would look like. Meanwhile, Vera's parentage didn't seem to be a hot topic. Paul was hard to miss, too. Even the high-necked, camouflage pants couldn't cover all his tattoos. We pulled into a parking lot near an old driveway bordering an abandoned parking lot. A broken gate guarded the covered path. Neil's car, a reasonably priced sedan, was parked on the road. Farewell and Vera arranged the introduction. With that said and done, the tour began. Neil stopped us immediately. "First stop is literally right here," Neil said, pointing to the ruined gate. "The entrance to the paper mill. It's been closed since the 1980s. People haven't taken kindly to the whole Clean Water Act. Technically we're violating that," Neil said. Vera laughed. "Huh. The locals have known about this place for decades. Even though it's kind of an insult to go inside, no one seems to care." Neil continued. "So it's not dangerous?" I asked. "Yes and no," Neil laughed. "It usually stays away, but we might catch a glimpse of it. But yeah, it's not a big crowd." As we pulled on our shoes, Neil told us what to expect and why this might be one of our most exciting trips. See, the Forza crowd isn't a supernatural ghost or an alien visitor. According to the locals, it's a very real creature. It's been around for decades and has been keeping itself in an old paper mill, he said. Most of the legislators in these parties know about it, but there was no immediate need for it. It's kept to itself, and the landowners aren't very kind to the government, Neil explained. "So, what does it look like? What can we expect?" I asked. "I can't, didn't he tell you?" Neil laughed. "Really? Really?" I said. Polly turned to Vera, but she just smiled. Neil shrugged. "It looks like 4 people. Just 4 normal people. 2 tall people in the back, and 2 shorter or hunched over people in the front. It's like they're taking a picture." Neil explained. It was as ridiculous as it sounded. And suddenly I saw why it wasn't a big deal. To an outsider, this thing only looked like 4 people. Even if I could see it with my own eyes, what was there to see? I couldn't help but think that Neil probably had a few people ready to give us a little scare. "Are you telling me we're going to get into a tetanus-covered mess watching 4 kids in Halloween masks stand at the end of the hall?" I whispered to Polly. "It could be fun." Polly shrugged. "I'm not buying it," I told him. Both suspicious of this unexpected revelation, Polly and I began asking questions. How, what the 4 people could look like and what they were really like. What they ate, where they lived, all sorts of things. I admit we were not being polite. Neil didn't seem to mind and did his best not to follow us. "He needs chlorine as part of his diet," Neil explained patiently. "That's why he moved to the factory. And nearby is a chlorine extraction machine that was used to bleach paper before it was shut down. There's still a lot of stuff around. It's in the water, too," Neil continued. "So he eats old paper?" I asked. "No, he eats deer and white-tailed rodents. But not birds. Damn, he loves birds," Neil explained. Vera had a hard time containing her happiness. We were giving him the "you're real" look and he couldn't help but smile. Neil, on the other hand, seemed happy to answer our questions. "So how big is it?" "It must be big if it eats deer," I asked as we entered a clearing in the woods. "Big enough to confuse 4 people. It's kind of a mime," Neil explained. "What did you fool people into?" I asked. "Well, either you look closely or scare them off. It depends," Neil said. "And have you seen it?" I said. "Of course," Neil nodded. "Maybe we'll see it from a distance if we're lucky. It moves around a lot." As we emerged from the clearing, we got a clear view of an abandoned paper mill. 6 large buildings and several chemical silos lined the banks of a dying river. It all looked worse for the worse. Most of the exteriors were elaborately carved and rusted. There wasn't a single window that wasn't damaged. Still, Neil didn't miss a beat. As we approached the road, he kept telling us interesting facts. "You can tell by the birdsong," he explained. This thing walks around in the sawdust like a dust bath and stops a lot of parasites. The birds love it, so they're usually around, ready to pick off little bugs and parasites. Something like an alligator, Neil said. I can hear the birds singing now, Polly laughed. Do you think this is the jungle or? Five's a crowd? The four's a crowd. No, it's just birds. The red ones usually come at him and make some kind of noise. Neil replied, giving him a cold look. Interesting, Polly sighed. Neil said nothing about it. We entered the mill through one of the truck entrances, past the collapsed garage door. I could taste the mold and the residual chemicals, but Neil swore we'd be fine. It was just humidity, apparently. Vera didn't seem so sure. We ascended to the second floor, climbing a rusty corridor with a broken railing. Rays of light streamed in through holes in the ceiling. From hazy to slowly fading. Looking at the factory, we could tell that this was not just an empty building, it must have been hastily abandoned. There were still a few luxury cars on the ground, most of them rusting from decades of neglect. There's a lot going on around here, Neil explained as we slowly inched forward. I don't think they'd nest unless they found a mate, and I can tell you there aren't many around. How? I asked. I don't think they have a way of finding each other, which suggests they may have once lived in colonies where you could just reach out and grab a mate. There are several holes around it where it sank, suggesting it might have been underground. I'd love to see that. I really do, Polly laughed. Okay, Neil shrugged. Let's go see one. Neil led us across the factory floor, through the corridor, into the ransacked lunchroom, and out the back near one of the silos. There was a huge room with a huge pile of sawdust in it. Easily the biggest pile I had ever seen. Paul's instinct was to climb it, but Neil advised against it. This thing is crawling with parasites. I'm not touching it. And you see that indentation there on the left side? It was right here, Neil explained. It feels like a sting to me, Polly said. Vera bumped her elbow and Polly made a lip-lifting motion. Neil did his best not to roll his eyes. Neil went on to describe the many discoveries locals had made over the years. For example, the Forsa had a larger body than one might think, but it hid it behind a crowd of 4 men, like an insect protecting its body. He claimed to have a sketch of this rear end from a side-view photograph taken in the late 1990s. Of course, it was vague at best. I could barely make out that there were people in the photo. There had also been a sharp decline in the white-tailed deer population in the area. While many have claimed it was due to overfishing, Neil said it coincided with the appearance of this creature in the early 1990s. It was a throwback pattern with Forsa. Everything about it could be explained by the most mundane things. It looked like people from afar. Its main food source was abundant. There was nothing immediate and obvious about it. Forsa could be anything. Maybe that's why we hadn't heard about it. Neil continued the tour and showed us the various buildings surrounding the complex. He told us about the early history of the various stations and the strange creatures that were rumored to live there. She brought up some other interesting points, most of which had to do with the early history of the creature and society in general. For example, there had been several people who got lost around the factory, but it was due to failure to comply with safety standards. Again, it wasn't clear. This could be blamed on a large, monstrous beast, but the most likely cause was simply an accident. Occam's razor. When we reached the back exit, Neil clasped his hands together. That's where I usually see him. He's moving around in the old chemical warehouse, over there, Neil said. So, what do we do? I asked. Should we get him out? I suggest we wait, Neil smiled. Put your feet up, and see the sights. It's a great place, isn't it? Paul came up to me and carefully grabbed my elbow to get my attention. He leaned over and whispered. The kids he hired to terrorize us haven't arrived yet, Paul said. Still, it was nice to spend time with friends to break up the monotony of work. We set up our tents and ate some hot dogs. Vera fell asleep listening to her favorite podcast. Polly ran onto the stage, sending small specks of dust onto the factory floor. The sound echoed throughout the building. I had a chance to sit with Neil for a while, just the two of us. He seemed like a really nice guy, but I could tell he was putting on a show. Again, it was his job. Vera had known him since high school, so she gave him a good price for it. In a quiet moment she asked, "So what's the matter? Why is this interesting?" I asked. "You know, it's funny. It's out there for everyone to see. And everything about it seems like a bunch of nothing." Neil smiled. "Come on. I mean, it's a great story. You put a lot of thought into this and I appreciate that. Most people say it's a ghost or an alien." I told him. "There it is," he nodded, lifting his hot dog from the open fire. "I'm not mad at you. This is real." I could tell there was no hesitation behind those eyes. This man was either a born liar or a true believer. Over the next 2 hours, the sky grew darker. Rain passed over us, but it didn't even sprinkle us with a few drops. A cloud bathed the rusty walls in black, and the shadows of our campfire were long and eerie. Spending the night there was impressive in itself. The uncomfortable sounds of metal creaking, along with Minnesota wildlife slithering through cracks in the sides of the building. We pitched our tents on the edge of the old office building, the risk of setting fire to nothing. It was probably visited by many rebellious teenagers. The graffiti spoke for itself. Neil assured us that Forsacrowd was unfazed by the crowd and would keep his distance. In his experience, he had no interest in hunting people down. Polly just rolled her eyes. The charade was going strong. I had a surprisingly restful sleep, nodding off the moment my head hit the pillow. I couldn't sleep for long, though. It was a few minutes before midnight when I heard a noise coming from Polly and Vera's tent. At first I thought they were just doing what adults do in a secluded tent, but after hearing the tent open, I opened my eyes. I was a little embarrassed to see Vera and Polly sneaking out with the toilet paper, clearly minding their own business. I was drifting back to sleep when a few minutes later I heard whispers outside my tent. I looked again to see Vera and Paul. They seemed a little more alert now. "Holy shit," Polly smiled. "They're here. You should see this." I looked over to Neil's tent. The man was fast asleep. Had he planned this in advance? How did he know we'd be there at night? Grabbing our flashlights and cameras and proper shoes, the three of us headed out to get a better look, leaving Neil in the tent. "Right around the corner," Vera whispered. "They're just standing there." There was a hole in the wall leading outside. First Polly left, then Vera. As soon as I stepped outside, I felt an immediate chill. Perhaps the storm was coming back. He slowly raised the flashlights to the east, and for the first time appeared. Forsaken. 4 people, hanging in the middle of the night. A man, a woman, and 2 young men in their late teens. Family, it seemed. They all stood together, wearing the same white shirts and dark blue pants. Everyone had the same hair color. Just different lengths. The parents stood side by side, while the little ones stood a step ahead with a little space between them. I couldn't stop staring. Vera took the picture with her digital camera, making sure to turn off the flash. It was awful. Even Paul felt it, even if he would never admit it. "She's spoiled," he whispered. "Why did they come so late?" "Maybe he heard we snuck out," Vera replied. "Either way, it's crazy." I wasn't so sure. It seemed a bit honest for Neil to talk about it so easily. With Polly's flashlight attached to them, they began to move slowly. Arms fixed to their sides, the four of them slowly moved aside. It was terribly coordinated. Moving in a sort of diagonal tandem. It was almost as if they were skating. We followed them for a bit to see what they were doing. They walked back toward one of the chemical silos, always watching us. As they went further, they seemed to accelerate. Vera barely had a chance to say, "Stop," before they entered the cabin. She still had that perfect unity. I even heard Polly sigh with relief as they disappeared. "Awful," he breathed. It was awful. As we were returning to our bivouac, we turned a corner, and suddenly stopped. More people. Another group of 4, much younger. Children, maybe 6 or 7 years old. 2 of them were a little taller, 2 a little shorter. All with outstretched arms and legs moving in the same strange diagonal tandem. Before we had a chance to speak, they let out a strange hissing sound and disappeared through a crack in the wall. This hadn't been part of the plan. I would never let children wander around in a place like this. It was dangerous. Whether it was Neil's idea or someone else's, it was just a bad idea. "We have to wake him," I whispered. "Now." And again, something in my head was telling me that it was so strange that I was just a bunch of wayward kids. The rational part of me insisted that it was nothing more than a horror or a misunderstanding. But another part of me began to wonder what the hell I had gotten myself into. We whispered to wake Neil, and we could hear him muttering to himself. He looked out of the tent with a wide cry. "They're here now," Vera said. "But the children are few." Neil blinked, looking back and forth from us. "What children?" he asked. Vera told him what we had seen outside. Neil didn't seem to stop until he saw a group of children rushing in. Neil sat there, scowling at his clothes. If he had been playing the role of guide up until now, this was the point when something changed. He asked her to clarify a few things. Their height, their speed, their reactions, their voices. Polly didn't seem to know what to make of this, torn between doubt and genuine concern. I was somewhere in the middle. "Well, Neil began. Forsycrowd are rumored to be a type of spider. Could be parthenogenetic." "What kind of, what? Genetic?" I asked. "Parthenogenetic," he explained. "Can reproduce effectively without a mate." Neil explained. "What does that even mean?" Polly asked. Neil paused for a moment, then got to work. "That means we have to go. It's nesting," he said. As we hurried to take down the tents and pack up, I noticed something overhead. Little red birds were fluttering in and out of the vents in the ceiling. About 10 of them. Thinking about what Neil had said earlier, I was sure he was referring to something about birds. I patted his shoulder and motioned him up. His face turned pale as he put a finger to his lips. Vera and Polly noticed this, so we all fell silent, moving slowly so as not to make too much noise. Every now and then, the birds would come down, make a little chirp, and then come back up. Vera couldn't breathe. We all stopped to look at him as he pointed down. There he was, slowly moving out of view. Only the 4 people's legs moved, their arms straight. Their heads bobbed slightly as they moved, looking more like baboons than humans. They seemed to still be floating forward, held back by some unseen force. But more worryingly, they were coming towards us. Little by little I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run. Part of me wanted to stand there and believe that it was all a lie somehow. It had to be. No monsters, I was sure. After years of laughing in the dark, I knew that monsters didn't really exist. But as these 4 strange people approached each other, I wasn't so sure anymore. Neil looked just as confused, if not more so. "No one's moving," he whispered. "Let's see what this is." I saw more faces emerging from the cracks and corners. 4 children, one by one, but another group of 4 children below. They didn't look like children at all, more like small adults. Everyone moved in the same strange pattern, taking each other's steps. It just didn't seem to end. Hair was sticking out of their eyes. One leg too short, the other too long. A gaping mouth that wouldn't stop shaking. 2 of them were tied to the shoulders and made a terrible roaring sound. I counted 6 groups in all. And some of the groups, they weren't human. They couldn't be. This isn't what people look like. The largest one that came close was bigger than I expected. It was easily 7 feet tall. Yet they were all looking at us with those glassy eyes. They didn't really have eyes, they looked more like white balls with random spots. One of the red birds landed gently on the tall creature's shoulder, then gently pecked its eye. It didn't even flinch. Polly held Vera tight as we all slowly backed away, leaving the little we had brought behind us. The fire had long since been extinguished, but the tall fire still trudged along perfectly in the wind. It behaved strangely. One of the people in front had to raise his legs straight up, they seemed to float in the air. But that was when the illusion was shattered. As he approached, he seemed to abandon tradition. One of the 2 figures in the front split in half to reveal an unusual set of legs the same color as their hair. Tall and thick-legged, it lurked behind an all-black creature with dark, beady eyes. They had been there the whole time, folded into vertical rows, acting as buttons for the back row's shirt. They unraveled like origami, disintegrating without a word, shattering the image I had of it, revealing a creature stretched to full size, easily breaking 9 feet in all directions with 2 hands. All the legs were camouflaged. Like half a person who when put together creates the illusion of a group of 4. Fake bodies, nothing more than membrane and skin, tossed lifelessly back and forth, sick compliments. I could barely hear the others screaming. Polly grabbed Vera and headed for one of the side exits. Neil kept saying, "No, no, no," over and over, not even running. And I was frozen, staring at the dim reflection of 8 eyes arranged in 4 perfect columns. His white-clad hands reached for his lower jaw, and I crawled closer. In that moment I thought I was going to die. I couldn't accept that this was really happening. 100 thoughts were running through my mind at once, drawing up all the strange possibilities that could explain this. A joke. A bad dream. Something. Nothing. I could have died that day. He turned to me suddenly. Polly had driven the sausage stick through his front right leg. Looking back, it had all been so fast. Using his legs, Forcecrowd had thrown it straight across the room and up to the top. It crashed into the platform railing above. Paul didn't move. Vera was in a panic, redoubling her efforts to get back. Neil grabbed her hand and headed for the side exit. I could try to go with them, but I couldn't deal with an angry creature. Instead, we should split up. Make him choose the path. Of course he was following me. I went straight ahead, in the wrong direction. Down the long corridor, my steps clattered against the dusty concrete. Dozens of tiny feet followed me, even their steps seemed human. As if they were wearing shoes. Big contractions, crawling forward on all 4s first, he was furiously pushing his way forward. He was so fast, so swirling. He seemed to have given up all attempts at imitation. All pretensions. I managed to climb to the podium. When I reached the top, the stairs collapsed behind me. I was slammed to the ground with a stream of metal. The creature couldn't follow these ancient paths. There was too much concentrated weight. That didn't stop it. Moments later, the tips of his arms wrapped around the platform as he hung upside down, trying to bite the metal. While I was fast, he could keep up. I felt my lower jaw sink into the steel and the soles of my shoes flutter. His arms reached towards me and finally ripped my coat off with his tiny claws. Part of the railing broke, and the creature balanced me, nearly knocking me to the ground below. Instead, he lost his strength and fell. It would only be seconds before he got back up to try again. He was a hungry creature desperate to feed his children. He wasn't a submissive gravity. Nothing more. There was a short platform connecting the two buildings. This thing had once resembled a glass tube, but now it was just a set of unstable platforms in the open air. Still, I didn't have much choice. I went for it. I still can't think straight. I have these brief memories of the chase. It felt like hours, even though it was only minutes. In my mind, I can picture every angle, every hit, every mistake, but it's hard to put it into words. It was just this long, turbulent section, weaving over each other like an adrenaline-fueled frenzy, a near-death experience. As I reached the other end of the platform, I saw Forsacrowd retreating into the darkness. He was smart. He knew the platform couldn't support his weight and he'd be hurt if he fell. I ended up the same way I came, on the same path Paul had taken, overlooking our previous campsite. I ran over to him. I could tell he was breathing, but he had a severe concussion. One eye was bloodshot and swollen, and his left arm was bent the wrong way. There was no way I was going to get him to leave anytime soon. I debated my options. I could leave. I could run. I could try to pick him up and take him with me. None of it seemed convincing. Besides, he wouldn't let go. Instead, he pushed us against the wall. Somehow, he was still conscious, if only barely. We sat there together listening to the red birds flying in and out of the broken ceiling. It turned out the paper hadn't reached us. He couldn't use the adjacent platforms and had no ladders left. Instead, he stood below us, reaching up in desperation. With a sort of fear-induced rage, I stood to look. The platform creaked, but it remained still. Our eyes met for a moment. This buttoned-up creature, completely emotionless. A being that understood nothing but flesh and bloodline. He reached for me again, carefully. Gently, even. It was as if a friend was telling me to surrender. I sat down next to Paul. He took a deep breath. He might have broken several ribs. I'm going to get a new tattoo, I sighed. Cider. Please don't do this, I replied. I can't kill you. No, it lubricates spiders, she muttered through her half-broken nose. Just not this one. As he pointed, the unusual legs slowly retreated backwards. Slowly the creature retreated into the complex. It was small, back and forth between the legs. From a distance, even then, it was still hard not to see them as just a group of four, standing in the dark. The two of us stayed there, dozing off from exhaustion. Trying to keep Paul steady, I frantically looked up at the sky and waited for the clouds to clear. Morning had to come sometime. That was the deal. Paul and I spent hours there waiting for Vera and Neil to return. They finally did and brought in some local law enforcement. They were able to help pull Paul out and treat his wounds. He would eventually lose an eye in surgery, but he would recover. He later got a spider tattoo. We talked a lot about uploading our photos and videos. But even now, when we look at the little snapshots we have, it feels like people are living in the dark. There's no attack or monstrous transformation. It's not like anything, it's just people. They're weird people, but they're still people. Neil told them about the fence reinforcement. As he suspected, Forsacrowd had undergone a form of self-fertilization, where they reproduce without a mate. We had done the equivalent of standing between an angry mother bear and her cubs. But then we lived to tell the tale. And they had done little to prevent it from happening again. Parts of the fence were repaired and a new sign put up. I think the owners came by to make some sort of announcement, but I couldn't find anything. It's been years since then. I've tried my best to find the right time to talk about it, but I never got around to it. It was too important to say it simply, and too hard to think about. Neil deleted his YouTube channel and removed his videos, not wanting more people to come looking for Force a Crowd. In fact, a lot of them were deleted from the web. Even the Wikipedia page, I think. I think he runs a riverboat rental business out east. But in a few months, Vera and Polly will be married. I think it's time to put this behind us and look to the future. As the best man, that's all I can really do. Because even if there are monsters out there, we can choose where to spend the night. I choose to spend it here, far away where the fire burns. Far away from Force a Crowd.
And so, the story ends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell button to receive all the stories. Like, share and rate the story in a comment. Thank you for watching.